Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Kyle, for that elaborate introduction. I'm grateful for this invitation for two reasons. One is that it provided me with the opportunity to actually familiarize myself with the works of Sonja and Luehrmann, from which I really enjoyed. I'm also glad that I was invited to give this talk so that it provides me an opportunity to connect with colleagues in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. I joined SFU last year, so I've been looking forward to this, to broadening my network and meeting colleagues. I also wanted to thank Kyle for the invitation, but also wanted to echo what he said, thanking Esther for graciously dealing with all the logistics. So allow me to begin. Tonight, I unravel the intricate relationship between statecraft, gender, and religion through the lens of spatial segregation in urban environments. Drawing from over 2 decades of ethnographic and archival work in Iran, I explore how the state, the Iranian state, utilizes gender segregation as a tool of governance to assert authority and shape public spaces as part of its evolving identity as an Islamic state. But rather than treating gender segregation as a rigid system, these policies reveal dynamic shifts. The state reacts to internal resistance, technocratic demands, and global pressures. The shifts in the Iranian state urges us to reconsider how governance operates at the intersection of gender and religion, especially as urban environments continually reconfigure social and political orders. While my focus is on Iran, my objective is broader, and this is, I was hoping to kind of bring that objective or work on it for this talk today, but I hope that we can do that during the Q&A. My objective is broader, and I want to push the discussion on gender segregation out of the silo of Islamic and Middle East studies and into the larger field of urban studies, particularly discussions and debates on exclusion and inclusion. I hope my talk tonight will spark such conversations. So let me zoom on Iran. The story begins in 1979 with the dissolution of the Pahlavi monarchy and the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran. The pivotal moment required a dramatic refashioning of the state, a reimagining of Iran's political identity through the lens of an Islamic state. Central to this reimagination were the spaces in which everyday life unfolded. And at the heart of this process were women. Women were not only the subjects of this transformation, but also its symbols, embodiments of Islamic morality. Their bodies became a stage where competing ideologies and political aspirations were performed. Consequently, Islamization hinged significantly on the enforcement of mandatory veiling and the formalization of gender segregation. Despite disagreements among the revolutionaries regarding the extent of gender segregation, the visibility and tangibility of these practices meant that gender boundaries became central to the Islamic Republic's self-conception. The state sought to solidify gender difference over the following decades by etching physical and symbolic boundaries across the urban landscape. The Iranian state anchored itself in material objects that in turn were imbued with ideological meanings, representing the new gender order. Examples of this include, and you can see it on the slide, the metal bar, the first one on the left top, the metal bar dividing bus spaces to separate men from women, or the walls encircling women-only parks, that's this one. Or the curtain that actually divides the Caspian Sea so that women's beaches are separate from men's beaches. These gender boundaries were driven primarily by religious and ideological imperatives, reinforcing the state's project of Islamization. However, my goal here is to unpack the porosity of these boundaries, revealing the ways in which the form, content, and meaning of gender segregated spaces have been in constant flux. These spaces are not static, but are reshaped by the politics and power dynamics that govern them. So what do the transformations in gender segregated spaces tell us about the changing modalities of state authority in Iran? I argue that gender segregated spaces in Iran have shifted from being primarily spaces of exclusion designed to restrict women's movements in the city during the 1980s to spaces of inclusion ostensibly created to facilitate women's presence in urban public life. This shift reflects and is driven by a broader transition in the state's mode of regulation from prohibition, which sought to suppress and disable undesired behaviors, to provision, which now aims to enable desired behaviors. Though the form and intensities of gender domination have evolved over time, I contend that this transition from a regime of prohibition to one of provision has been managed through the discourse of protection. I'm going to go to the next slide, but I wanted to highlight here that basically I'm talking about different regimes of gender segregation, and in which the mode of regulation varies. So in both regimes, gender domination stays the same, but the intensity of it or the form of it, the shape it takes changes. Mode of regulation is from prohibition to provision. We see that the state initially during the 1980s was addressing women as subjects of Islamic morality. And then during 2000, the women were addressed by the state as citizens with needs. I will get to that. The discourse with which gender segregation was justified or was presented to the population changed from a discourse that was mainly a religious discourse to a more secular liberal discourse where gender segregation was justified by framing these spaces as something that women need and as spaces in the city that women are entitled to. And while I do argue that these spaces, dominant feature of them changed and are now considered spaces of inclusion, this doesn't mean that gender domination has disappeared. It's a new form of gender domination. Whether it is protecting women's virtue and chastity in the name of Islamic morality or safeguarding their rights and safety in the name of liberal citizenship, the state's portrayal of itself as a protector remains constant. This enduring characterization underscores the flexibility of a state power, adapting its strategies of regulation to different contexts while maintaining its overarching claim to authority over women's bodies and movements. So in the book that Kyle mentioned, I actually look at gender segregation across space and across time. But for the talk tonight, I thought maybe it's best if I focus on just one case so that I can also bring in some of the anthropological stories and material that I have. But this is the overall argument that I have. I look at gender segregation from segregated spaces from 1980s to 2000, and I look at it across different spaces. So women-only parks, which obviously is for women only, gender segregated buses where men and women are in separate spaces of the bus, and soccer stadium, Azadi soccer stadium, which is women are prohibited from entering the stadium because the stadium is considered to be a masculine space and it's not proper because of the way men talk. It's not a proper space for women to enter. So, and then the overall argument is that what we see in the 1980s is the table that I just shared with you, that we see that during the 1980s, the state was predominantly using a prohibitive language. So the discourse was, let's start with the parks. The state prohibited women's outdoor exercise. The discourse was Islamic morality because it was assumed that women's jogging and jumping and movement in public spaces and in front of men would be sexually provocative. Therefore, again, the prohibition and the pressure was put on women to limit their movements or not move. And so women had to be the embodiment of, or were presented as embodiment of Islamic morality. Flash forward 2000, and that's my talk tonight, we see that the state provides segregated outdoor exercise spaces for women. The discourse this time is public health. Women do need these spaces, and so the state is encouraging women to come out and exercise. And gender segregation in this case is a way of rewriting women back into the city. And women are framed as unhealthy citizens who need exercise spaces. I'm happy to, the talk is long, I'm happy to go over the other two cases during Q&A if there is interest or there are questions about it. So to flesh out the argument that I have, I will take you inside the Mother's Paradise, Tehran's first women-only park, where these shifts that I just talked about are vividly illustrated. Perched on the Abbasabad Hills in northeast Tehran, Mother's Paradise is one of over 2,500 parks in the city and the first of 4 women-only parks in Tehran. Established in 2007, the park spans 37 acres. Though women can access mixed parks, their presence in these public spaces in mixed parks is contingent on wearing the veil. So women are not banned from accessing accessing public parks, public mixed parks. But if you want to use the public mixed parks, women need to have their head covered and wear long sleeves. In the Mother's Paradise, women are, and this is from the mission statement on the park's website, which is owned by the state, are free from this restriction. They can remove their veils and wear the clothing of their choice. On Fridays, which is a holiday in Iran, Friday is a weekend in Iran, the park is open to families, transforming into a mixed space open to all. But again, on Fridays, if women want to use the space, they need to cover their hair. The park is equipped with fitness machines, a daycare center, a playground, a bike trail, a library, a health center, picnic areas, and chess tables. Over 70 female employees manage and maintain the park, but as state representatives, they are the only women in the park who remain covered because they're representative of the state. They handle everything from gardening and cleaning to conducting group exercises. Female police guards ensure security inside, while 2 male guards patrol the entrance of the park to prevent men from entering or harassing women outside the park. The park is popular with growing usage. Schools, government organizations, and district municipalities frequently use it for extracurricular activities or staff retreats. Government officials have stressed that the state provided parks to women out of a concern for women's health problems that stemmed from lack of fresh air and exercise. Yet in the early 1980s, leisure sports and exercise came to be considered unnecessary and even un-Islamic. A problem. The rest of my talk will trace the state's evolving narrative around women's outdoor exercise and women-only parks. Initially framed as a problem, they later came to be framed first as a solution to the problem of Western cultural invasion, and later as a response to women's mental and physical health needs. So back to 1980s, when women's exercise was framed as a problem and the state's predominant mode of regulation was prohibition. In the early 1980s, as the Islamic Republic consolidated its political rule domestically and fought the 8-year war with Iraq. So the war with Iraq lasted went from 1980 to 1988. Sports during this time were deemed unnecessary and un-Islamic. Iran boycotted the Olympics and withdrew from all international competitions. Specifically, women's exercise and leisure activities were viewed as morally decadent and thus prohibited. The regime's focus was on crafting pious, educated mothers, evident in both pronatalist, and educational policies of that era. The question of women's leisure and physical exercise was addressed in a prohibitive way by specifying where women could not go and what women could not do. Reports from Zan Roz magazine, a long-standing women's weekly, reveal public frustration at the criminalization of women's movements or public displays of happiness. The harshness with which the newly established state reacted to seemingly trivial acts of rebellion or just everyday acts, like showing strands of hair or jogging in public parks, was related to the subversiveness they attributed to the breakdown of the moral code, a code which they considered necessary to eliminate imperialist cultural values, but also to reinforce an Islamic way of life. As a result, women's outdoor exercise in parks became so stressful because guards were monitoring the parks to make sure that no woman is doing movements that are not allowed. The outdoor exercise became so stressful that many opted to exercise indoors instead. As one woman quoted in Zan Roz magazine put it, exercise in the park defeats the purpose because of all the anxieties it entails these days. Some sports officials, for those who are familiar, Hassan Ghafouri Fard, suggested building indoor facilities for women, but Iran's war-dominated budget meant little progress was made. During this time of prohibition, women's outdoor exercise didn't completely disappear. It just retreated to the stealthy corners of outdoor spaces. Thus, despite frequent warnings and interruptions from the guards, those women who were enthusiastic about outdoor group exercise, although still few in number in the 1980s, went to parks or enclosed public spaces, public areas, such as the green spaces of large residential complexes, to silently and discreetly perform their morning exercises. When I was doing interviews and was having conversation with various women in Tehran, one of them told me that, who was now 44-year-old, she told me that she and her friends, both male and female, would get together in the green space of Parc de Prince apartments in Shiraz Avenue in Tehran to play volleyball, something they could not do in public parks. After all, the government guards could not be in all places all the time. Stated Zahra, one of the other women with whom I had a conversation, who has since 1989 lived in Ekbatan, a sprawling high-rise community in Western Tehran with its own exclusive facilities and green space. These comments evidence both the costly and limiting nature of the prohibitive measures. So what I want to highlight here is that by the end of 1980s or the beginning of 1990s, what we can see is that these spaces or these stealthy acts of exercise were growing. And then in 1990s, there were several developments happened, and that pushed the state to frame women's outdoor exercise not as a problem, but as a solution to Western cultural invasion. And they started coordinating women's outdoor exercise in both women-only parks and also mixed parks. And these are, in both slides, these are the murals and graffitis on the walls of Tehran. And I wanted to show the difference. So during 1980s, it was all mostly about wars and martyrs and anti-US rhetoric. And then during that's a mistake, not 1900, 1990s, I apologize about that. It was more about beautification of the city. So it was exactly that, beautification of the city, but also that word up there means peace. So solh. So it's the city was changing, and so was the ideology or the mood that the state was trying to inject into its population. Between 1989 and 1997, Iran had Hashemi Rafsanjani as its president and pursued economic liberalization, following World Bank-inspired structural adjustment policies and advocating a free market economy might have been helpful in temporarily saving Iran from a post-war economic crisis, but like many other state projects and policies, it produced undesired effects as well. And undesired, when I say undesired, it's undesired for the state, unintended. Opening the domestic market to consumer imports as part of the liberalization of the economy and as a salve to a war-deprived population also brought unintended consequences along the lines of what Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader of the Islamic Republic, labeled cultural invasion. Western cultural products had invaded the domestic market through widespread informal and black market networks. The global commercialization of Western leisure products and practices had put Iran in a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis the West in what was termed the cultural war. And the cultural war undermined the Islamic Republic's efforts to maintain the Islamic features of its cities and citizens. The loosening attachment to the revolutionary and religious ideals and values thus became one of the greatest concerns of the state, and this loosening attachment has been documented in various surveys that have been conducted during that era. Bad hijabs, a term referring to women who were lax in maintaining their Islamic hijab, came to be seen as a sign of this detachment, or so it was interpreted by the state, by foreign observers, and even by social scientists. These alarming social developments, these pathologies, generated a sense of urgency among state officials to advocate for the expansion of public spaces and spheres. Governmental reports identified unemployment, the marriage crisis, and the lack of cultural and sports facilities as contributing to the expansion of morally corrupt network. The state's approach shifted. Officials realized that prohibition alone would not suffice. New technologies like satellite TV and the internet made it difficult to monitor individual behavior. Instead, the state began to promote alternative cultural spaces. Women-only parks emerged as part of this solution. In 1993, the Presidential Center of Women's Affairs, led by Shahla Habibi, pushed for the creation of such parks, advocating for the conversion of Talaqani Park, which was a mixed park, into a women-only space. Habibi explained that these parks would allow women to exercise in open air, free from the veil. In an interview with Zaneruz, she stated, "The lack of morally healthy entertainment hubs and spaces could have dangerous moral implications for susceptible groups like women and the youth." The Tehran municipality endorsed the idea, arguing that women-only parks could redirect attention away from the infiltrating Western cultural goods and prevent behavioral patterns associated with such goods. Here we see the emergence of a discourse that frames women's exercise and entertainment not as a problem, but as a solution to other problems, namely Western cultural invasion. However, the initial implementation failed. The park, Talaqani Park, which was a mixed park, was only designated for women, to women 3 days a week, from 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. So again, you see that there is a particular woman in mind. 6 a.m. to 4 p.m., it's a housewife. The assumption was women are not working or are not supposed to be working. And of course, after 4 p.m., they're supposed to be back home to serve the husband. Poor advertising, lack of public transport access, and the still limited appeal of fitness led to low turnout. By the end of the 1990s, Talaqani Park was mostly reclaimed by men, illustrating the state's half-hearted attempt at creating women-only spaces. Despite these challenges, the project initiated a broader push for women's exercise spaces. Municipalities began setting up women's sports offices to coordinate morning group exercises in mixed public parks, now supervised by female instructors hired by the state. Women, while still observing hijab, participated in aerobics and stretching exercises, activities unimaginable a decade earlier. Women's morning exercises and competitions in public parks were no longer policed by the state, but rather organized, coordinated, and regulated by it. Women's outdoor exercise previously carried out in stealth was now approvingly carried out under the gaze of female instructors hired by the state. In other words, the state managed to bring under its wings that part of the everyday life that had flourished outside its permitted zones. It might be easy for onlookers to see these changes as improvements to women's quality of life, yet while that may be true, the state has also used these improvements to expand its reach into previously unregulated areas of women's lives. By the late 1990s, the reform era under Mohammad Khatami marked further social and political liberalization. Though economic liberalization continued, political divisions between conservatives and reformists hindered smooth collaboration. Despite their differences, both factions agreed on the need to expand spaces for women and the youth. For reformists, these spaces represented the expansion of women's public presence, while for conservatives, they functioned as regulated areas limiting women's access to, or curbing women's access to public spaces. Regardless of intent, the result was an increase in exercise and leisure spaces for women, setting the stage for the eventual success of women-only parks. So flash forward to 2000 onward, basically. Women-only park comes to be framed as a solution to public health problems, and the state starts providing exclusive spaces in the city for women only. In the early 2000s, a shift occurred in how women's health and public space were addressed in Iran. A report by the Education and Training Organization of Tehran, ETO from now on, a subdivision of the Department of Education, highlighted the poor health of schoolgirls, primarily attributing it to their lack of access to sports facilities. The report suggested that due to their lack of access to sports facilities and thus their lack of physical activity, schoolgirls were suffering from various bone and joint diseases. This, the report suggested, was partially the outcome of the state's earlier project of urban development and partially caused by women's obligation to veil and cover their bodies in public. It also suggested that the covering, which is required by law, had caused a lack of exposure to sunlight, which in turn caused hair loss. One of the main recommendations listed in the ETO report was that the city facilitate the expansion of space for schoolgirls' sport by creating parks for them. While in earlier decades, women's exercise had been framed as an antidote to the Western cultural invasion, with considerations for women's health added as an afterthought, now the health of women was brought to the fore, and women-only parks were presented as a solution to public health problems. The report identified two factors, as I said, urban development and compulsory veiling. Women's veiled bodies, which had once symbolized the state's properly Islamic identity, had turned into unhealthy bodies symbolizing the state's failure to provide and care for its subjects. That the connection between vitamin D deficiency and hair loss and women's hijab was a publicly discussed problem only 2 decades after the founding of the Islamic Republic shows how the Islamic Republic was able to draw upon the authority of medical discourse in the modern world, despite its own strong ideological commitment to mandatory veiling as a principle of its sovereign identity. In this context, the Iranian state had to acknowledge the medical discourse of deprivation and respond to it through the provision of women-only parks. As a result, the Iranian state was caught in the contradictions of its own identity as a modern Islamic nation. In a fine balancing act, the report made the expression of criticism against mandatory veiling possible and opened the space for them at the official level, while at the same time depoliticizing these criticisms by presenting them as part of a health problem and not as a rejection of the principle of religious obligation or veiling per se. So by medicalizing the issue of the veil, this report, which was actually produced by the reformist faction within the state, they managed to depoliticize the issue and allow a discussion or allow a discussion around it. So the state dealt with the problem by continuing to require mandatory veiling, not just as a religious obligation, but as a solution to contemporary women's objectification through the male gaze, while encouraging segregated unveiling as a solution to contemporary bodies deprivations. By 2003, the conservative mayor of Tehran called for the conversion of existing parks into women-only parks. 4 parks were selected based on 3 criteria. The first one was social justice, was spatial justice. The authorities wanted to make sure that the green space and the sports and entertainment facilities were evenly distributed across the city and available to women of varying classes. So in Tehran, the north part of Tehran is more affluent and better equipped with facilities, and the southern parts of Tehran are less developed. And they tried to locate 4 large parks in 4 corners of Tehran to make sure that women across Tehran and of all various classes have access to these parks. So the first criteria was spatial justice. The second one was accessibility. The park had to be built in places that were easily accessible by public transportation so that women would have no difficulty reaching them. And the third one was what they called visual security. In order to satisfy the clerics that the uncovered women inside the park were protected from the prying eyes of men, the parks had to be built either on heights or in places that could be easily partitioned off by trees and or walls. These were ironically deemed as wuthering heights by one of my interviewees. So what you see up there, it's also covered by, these are, the walls were thin green iron sheets, basically. These criteria suggest that the state, in responding to what it had formulated as women's need, had to take into account the religious as well as popular demands and concerns of and about women. In 2004, it was the Tehran City Council, led by the conservatives, that passed the bill permitting the municipality to pursue the creation of women-only parks. And I'm going to read, because it's important, both this one and then the bill that comes after. It's important how they frame the whole thing. With respect to mothers' constructive position, their role in the growth of society, their emotional and educational centrality within the family, and their effective role in the process of human cultivation and reduction of social pathologies, and with the aim of boosting their mental and physical capabilities, directing their leisure time, and providing them with appropriate opportunities for healthy entertainment in Tehran, the municipality is obliged to provide and allocate proper spaces in the existing parks. Furthermore, it will design and establish exclusive spaces in Tehran to be called mothers' parks. With respect to, note the transformation of the official language. Women go from being schoolgirls, the initial report was about schoolgirls, mentioned in the 2002 report by ETO, to being mothers, reinforcing the notion that although a woman may have rights and needs as individual, as a girl, she may claim them only as a family member. This use of familial language also has an additional effect. It constitutes an attempt by the state to desexualize public space and regulate sexuality in public. Yet ironically, the state's gender boundary drawing and the practices of mandatory veiling and gender segregation are heteronormative policies that reproduce sexualized bodies by admitting that these require regulating. These contradictions inherent in state policies have also prompted the state agencies and their political superiors to articulate in official discourse their concern over and intention to mitigate the problems earlier policies have brought about. This is clearly reflected in the way state institutions represent the reasons for women-only parks. According to the bill passed by the City Council in 2004, women-only parks are multidimensional in purpose, redressing a variety of pressures that crowded urban living has created for women. And I'm reading from the bill. The expansion of apartment living and the increase in the frequency of everyday frictions and tensions and the lack of sports spaces have led to irreparable consequences, such as limited movement capabilities and heightened physical and consequently mental and emotional disorders, especially for women. These problems are 200 times more for mothers because they have to deal with pregnancy. I'm not sure where the research for that came from. With pregnancy complications, childcare problems, and housework duties. The mothers' parks, by creating natural spaces and providing proper facilities and offering entertaining programs, could offer a venue for a variety of sports activities which suit different age cohorts within the target population. The language used in the officials' interviews and reports on women-only parks highlights the shift in the state's attitude towards women's leisure activities and exercise. Women were now recognized as both mothers of the nation and citizens with needs, whose health was in danger and who therefore had to be served by the state. As citizens, they have paid their dues during the revolution and the war, wrote 175 members of the parliament in a letter, stating that it is now the state's obligation to serve them. Emphasizing the responsibilities of the state towards its citizens, Muhammad Ali Mukhtari, the head of the Parks and Green Space Organizations of Tehran municipality, also stated, if because of our religion and moral beliefs, we impose specific codes of conduct on women, then we have to provide them with a space where they can enjoy the green space freely and securely. Thus, in their statements about the opening of the Mother's Paradise, state officials and city councilors managed to shift attention away from state-imposed compulsory veiling towards optional unveiling in select spaces provided by the government. As a result, perhaps inadvertently in these statements, the focus shifted from the association of veiling with lack of freedom to the association of unveiling with freedom. And most important, with freedom being provided by the state. Here, once again, the intricate mechanisms of state power lay hidden from sight while the world saw the liberal mandate of individual choice. The mayor of Tehran, I think, actually won an international award for serving the women. The clerics were happy, international observers were happy, everybody was happy in that period of time. Instead of presenting itself as the prohibitor or curtailer of freedom, the state now presented itself as the provider upon whom subjects could rely. The park was welcomed by most of the women who populated it on a daily basis. So because I had to read from the text, I just thought I put everything in a diagram. This is my short summary of my argument so far. 1980s, I'm not gonna read it. You heard it a lot, but this is basically the summary of everything I just said so far. But something else had also happened during this time. Although as early as the 1990s, some state officials had expressed concerns over the lack of exercise space for women and its negative impact on their health, the first attempt to establish a women-only park in 1993, as I just mentioned, had failed partly because women, as the potential users of this space, showed little interest in using such spaces. Remember the Talaqani Park that was left, that was deserted by women and so was reclaimed by men. The success of this new emphasis on the discourse of women's health and its appeal to women can only be understood in the context of the increasing importance of municipal and sub-municipal divisions in promoting women-only parks and their importance for women's health. Now, countries across the globe by 2000 were proudly focusing on cultivating healthy bodies. So cultivating healthy bodies had become a global discourse. And Iran was no exception. The idea was cultivating healthy bodies through proper nutrition and sufficient exercise. And so I can give you an example. In the early 1990s, the Jane Fonda workout videos were found only in well-to-do families, in well-to-do houses in Iran. But by the 2000s, There were thousands of yoga and aerobics classes across the country, including in religious cities such as Mashhad, Isfahan, and even Qom, which is the religious capital of Iran. Mansoura, one of the female exercise instructors of Tehran municipality, stated in her interview with me that the municipality aims to provide women with one woman-only park in each district of Tehran. Mansoura said, "Women want more of these parks." When I shared this news with a group of women in the Mother's Paradise, they all welcomed the much delayed initiative. Women want more of what the state wants them to want. The convergence of individual women's interests with state interests completes the process through which, in dealing with women's outdoor exercise and activities, the state ultimately enables its desired behaviors and practices, such as women exercising separately from men, not through coercion and prohibition, but through protection and provision. But what does this process entail? How does the state ultimately succeed in promoting women-only parks? The answer, I argue, lies in what I call scaling down and the municipalization of health. The key mechanisms through which the state successfully negotiates and redraws the gender boundary to expand women's access to public green and exercise spaces. This is the last section talk. The story of Mother's Paradise goes beyond the politics of gender segregation and women-only parks. It offers a lens into the evolution of state-building projects. In its second decade, the Islamic Republic of Iran faced unintended consequences of its earlier policies, compulsory veiling and urban development, had left Tehran overcrowded, polluted, and depressed. Women's mental and physical health concerns, often linked to veiling and constrained lifestyle, revealed the shortcomings of a system that had once promised dignity and integrity to women. At the same time, the rise of bad hijab and women's increasing defiance of public exercise bans pointed to the limits of the state's prohibitive measures. In addition, with the globalization of cultural and political products and practices, Iran found itself in a disadvantageous position vis-a-vis the West, in which the banning of Western products was no longer feasible. Within this environment, far too many things were escaping the state's regulatory authority. I call it in my book, gender boundary crisis. It was against this background that the Iranian state reconfigured its mode of regulation to what seemed to be a more effective and productive form, provision of exclusive exercise spaces for women. By seizing upon the problem it had created, the state invested on its own failure as opportunities to shape a problem space to which it could offer a solution. Basically, it was the solution that framed the problem. Mother's Paradise, located atop the Abbasabad Hill, symbolizes this shift in state power. Rather than being merely a product of religious mandates or anti-Western rhetoric, the park emerged from a health-focused discourse, which aligns state and societal interests. This medicalization of women's issues, especially mental health, provided the state an opportunity to redraw gender boundaries while embedding itself deeper into everyday life. The scaling down of state power through municipalization and local health initiatives enabled the expansion of women's exercise spaces framed by a discourse on health. Tehran municipality even launched a Department of Health in 2005, staffed by physicians whose mission was to promote urban health and active lifestyle. And this is just the structure of the Iranian government, but what I wanted to show was the municipality and how eventually there were district affairs that go to all districts, and then the Department of Health and Women's Sports offices also have branches in every district, and then smaller branches in every neighborhood in Iran. The initiative was partially, the health department, the opening of the health department, was partially funded and encouraged by the new urban health policies and projects of WHO. That's another thing I usually say, that Iranian studies usually suffers from methodological nationalism. It's as if anything that happens in Iran in order to study what's happening in Iran, people look inward, what's happening at the domestic politics, and they rarely look at Iran's connection to WHO, UN, in the case of sports stadium, FIFA, for example. So WHO was actually funding these projects. Furthermore, as part of WHO's emphasis on increasing physical activity, countries such as Iran developed new public health campaigns aimed at reducing the prevalence of lifestyle diseases such as arthritis, heart disease, obesity, and diabetes. Dr. Golmakani, head of the Department of Health, told me during an interview that all doctors, my colleagues here in the Department of Health, will need to act like caring parents. His colleagues included doctors, experts, and instructors who were recruited to serve the citizens in one of the 400 health houses at various sites that go all the way down to the neighborhood level. He was calling on the doctors to win the hearts and minds and trust of the citizens by incorporating the compassionate demeanor of a caring parent. Or in other words, to be pastoral rather than disciplinary or repressive. In fact, these health experts, along with exercise instructors of the women's sports offices, were charged with shepherding the population's health and happiness. To make exercise pleasurable on a daily basis, they organize collective events such as hiking, marathons, yoga, aerobics, or simple stretching exercises, both in women-only parks and in the separate spaces in mixed gender parks. For example, during one of the events organized by the municipality's Department of Health to mark the naming of October 20th as the National Day of Iranian Women's Health by the municipality, the then Minister of Health, Marzieh Vahid Dastjerdi, exercised alongside the other female participants to highlight the importance of exercise for women's health. This might have just been arranged as a photo op, I believe, but that itself shows how state officials at the national level realize the importance of everyday spaces and activities. In another event organized by Tehran municipality, around 7,000 senior citizens, including thousands of women, gathered in Velayat Park in southern Tehran to mark Health Week. Such work facilitates the interpellation of women into particular ways of being good, modest, and healthy and active citizens at the same time. Through the provision of health-promoting activities in segregated spaces, women are enjoined to constitute themselves as particular subjects embodying both the moral, modest subjecthood required by Islamic morality and the ideal of an active and healthy citizen promoted by international health organizations as well as liberal politicians. In this way, the state exercised a more effective form of power that was focused more on regulation than prohibition and was more concerned with the enabling of desired practices than with disabling of undesired ones. The story of the gradual reopening of public spaces for women, therefore, is the story of the gradual reorientation of state power. However, the focus on state power and its deepening influence does not negate women's agency and resistance. I understand that my talk so far has been very much top-bottom because I wanted to show how the state's mode of governance has changed. But women's lives are shaped and affected by competing discourses that demarcate the boundaries of the proper, define women's rights and needs, and demarcate the confines of the possible. These imperatives and discourses are disabling and enabling, and women live in this in-betweenness, in spaces where their bodies are simultaneously constricted because, for instance, their movements are limited within certain spaces, and expanded because, for example, women-only spaces are subjected to lesser degrees of surveillance. And I'm going to go off the script here to share an anecdote. So in one of my visits to this women-only park, I came across members of the 1 million signature campaign, which was a feminist campaign. They were collecting signatures to oppose the discriminatory laws in Iran. They were aspiring to reach 1 million signatures. And this activist told me every time we would form a meeting or arrange a workshop, organize a workshops, our places would be raided by security officers. But because they think that women-only parks are feminine spaces and are apolitical, there is no surveillance here, and there is not, the regulation is not tight. So they had basically mobilized to go to these parks, and they would arrange to have everyday conversations with women, and they had managed to repurpose these parks to collect more signatures. The walls of Mother's Paradise, like the metal bars dividing bus spaces, are not just symbols of control, but also sites of contestation. Women engage with competing discourses on health, morality, and rights, and use these to negotiate their position within the city. These negotiations lead to what I call differential exclusion and inclusion. Instead of seeing exclusion and inclusion as a binary, I see them on a spectrum, where women experience varying degrees of being in and out of place. They may benefit from certain policies, such as women-only parks, while being excluded from others, like access to stadium, all within the same context. The interplay of power and resistance is riddled with ambivalence, as women are able to be both in and out of place at once and in multiple contexts. While in the eyes of the state, women are supposed to have a specific place in a system of gender difference and to be kept within its confines, the exigencies of domestic and international political, economic, and bureaucratic circumstances on occasions require the state not to rigidly police gender boundaries. As pointed out, even when the rigid rules continue to apply on paper, their implementations at times became more relaxed, to the point that the policies of the state and its approach to handling women's issues were informed by what I call flexible sexism. As the state itself is not coherent, but rather a complex balancing act among its different components, various incumbents, diverse interests, and disparate ideologies, it is imperative that our analyses do not merely disaggregate the state, but also consider the multiplicities of its effects, impacts, and interventions. Only then can we talk about the various ways in which different segments within the state address women, recognize or dismiss them, include or exclude them, and ultimately set them in and out of place. I am going to end here. I'm happy to engage with questions that are about this particular case, but I'm also hoping to have a broader discussion about other cases of spatial segregation and control in other contexts. Thank you very much.
Question?